I never looked like my parents, and I noticed that even before people pointed it out. My mom always told me I had special genes, but as I got older, the jokes stopped being funny because their answers felt like they were hiding something. We didn't have baby pictures of me before I was 2, and there were no stories about the hospital or my first steps. So when I asked, they just said I was a quiet baby or they didn't take many pictures back then. But it was weird because we had tons of photos from trips, birthdays, and holidays. Just nothing from when I was really little, and that quiet grew bigger as I got older. One night in my last year of high school, I was at my friend Matt's house, and we watched a show where a guy took a DNA test and learned his dad wasn't his real dad. Matt laughed and told me to imagine finding out my whole family was fake, and everyone else laughed too, but I didn't. Later, I asked him if he'd ever take a DNA test, and he shrugged and told me he wouldn't because if your family treats you good, you don't need to dig for secrets. I told him he was probably right, but that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I started looking up on my phone things like how to tell if you're adopted or signs your parents are hiding something. I didn't buy a test, but I thought about it every single day. One week before I was supposed to leave for college, my parents sat me down, and my mom looked like she'd been crying, but my dad stood by the window with his arms crossed like he couldn't sit still. She told me they thought it was time I knew, and I already felt it inside because she told me I was adopted. They tried for years to have a baby and went to doctors, but it didn't work. So they adopted me, and they told me it was their happiest day. My dad told me I'd always been their son, and nothing changed that. I thanked them and even smiled. But the moment I went to my room, I opened my laptop and applied to a college on the other side of the state. They thought I was going to the one we visited, but I wasn't. And starting over felt good because no one knew who I was, and I didn't have to answer questions or pretend I was okay. A few days into my first week, I went to this random house party near campus. It was loud and chaotic, but it was exactly what I needed. I found a quiet spot in the kitchen, and that's where I met her. She wasn't a student there, but she was visiting a friend for the night, and she was almost done with high school. We talked for hours, first about music and school and dumb stuff, but then she told me her mom died from cancer a few months ago, and I told her I just found out I was adopted, and somehow it felt okay. We started talking every day after that, and then we hung out, and soon we were together, and it got serious fast. 2 months later, she came to my dorm one night and didn't knock, but she put a small bag on the sink, so I followed her to the bathroom. Inside the bag was a pregnancy test, and it was positive. I didn't even have time to say anything, so we sat on the floor quiet, but she rested her head on me and told me we should tell our families. I was scared, but I agreed because she was the only person who made me feel like I belonged, and I wasn't going to run from that. We planned a simple dinner with her, me, and our parents, and I called my dad first, but he sounded weird as soon as I brought it up and told me he had a work thing that night and couldn't come. My mom took the phone and told him he was missing me becoming a dad, and I told her it was fine because her mom was gone, so it might be better with just her. Thea and I will schedule something with dad, but later, and she said yes, but she wasn't happy, and I didn't blame her, but I just wanted the night to go smoothly. The night of the dinner, we picked a quiet restaurant and we got there early, me, her, and my mom, but when the door opened, she stood up fast and told her dad to come over with a big smile. I turned to look and my entire body froze. It was my dad, the one who said he was busy, and he stopped when he saw me. I stood up and asked him why he was there, and she looked at me and said,
"That's my dad."
My mom's smile disappeared and her shoulders dropped like someone had punched the air out of her. Then she turned slowly toward me like she was trying to understand what she was seeing. But my girlfriend looked at her, still smiling, completely unaware, and told her,
"Isn't he great? That's my dad."
She even reached to hug him, but he didn't move. And that's when my mom stood up and placed her napkin on the table and walked toward the door without her coat or purse or anything. I followed her out the door, and a few seconds later, so did he. The parking lot was nearly empty with cold air and weak streetlight buzzing overhead. She stood near the curb, and he walked a few steps behind her like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to get closer. I stood between them and didn't say a word, just watched and waited. But then she turned and asked him,
"What are you doing here?"
He didn't answer at first, but then he said,
"I didn't know he'd be here."
He kept going and told her his daughter, my girlfriend, invited him to meet her boyfriend's family, and he thought it was just her mom and maybe a sibling, and he thought he could show up, shake hands, play proud parent, and leave. But he didn't expect the boy to be me. He admitted it and told her everything, that after they adopted me, something broke in him, and he felt like a guest in his own house, and no matter how much love he gave, it wasn't enough to fill the part of him that needed a biological child. So he found someone, but didn't say who, just that she was kind, lonely, and it wasn't supposed to be serious, but then she got pregnant, and instead of coming clean, he panicked and told her he couldn't destroy what we had or face what that would mean for his marriage. So he supported her from a distance, sent money, and showed up when he could, and he built a second life on the ashes of a lie, but now both of them were burning. My mom didn't say a word through all of it and just stared at him, then down at the pavement like her brain was trying to unwrite the last 20 years. He stepped forward and told her,
"I never wanted it to end like this."
but she said,
"But you knew it could."
That's all she said before she walked away, but this time with no one following. I stayed there frozen, watching him, and trying to figure out how the man I looked up to turned into someone I didn't recognize. Eventually, I went back inside, and my girlfriend was still at the table, chewing on her lip and checking her phone. She looked up when I sat down and asked me if everything was okay, but I just stared at her, and she leaned in and asked me what happened and why my mom acted strange. But I didn't know where to start, so I just told her the man she called dad was my dad too. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out, and I told her I didn't know how, but I knew he raised me, and I knew he lied to both of us. She looked down at the table, and her fingers tightened around her water glass, and then she said it.
"But you're adopted, right?"
That question hit me harder than I expected, because yes, I was. But now everything about that story felt different, and I wondered if it wasn't just an adoption. What if it was damage control or a cover-up, but she kept staring at me and asked in a voice barely above a whisper.
Are you saying we're...
I don't know, I said quickly. I don't think so. I mean, I hope not. And that was the part no one wanted to say out loud. We sat there in silence for a long time, and eventually the waiter came by and asked if we wanted to order, but she shook her head and I couldn't even look at him, so we left without finishing the meal. Back at the car, we sat quietly, and I put my keys in the ignition but didn't turn them, and she held her phone like she wanted to call someone but didn't know who. And then, just before we drove off, she looked at me again and said,
Do you think your mom knew about her? About me?
and I realized I didn't know the answer. Because maybe she did. Maybe she always had. The next morning felt like waking up from a dream I couldn't shake off. I sat on the edge of my dorm bed, phone in hand, staring at her contact name, but I didn't call her. Not because I didn't want to talk to her, but because I didn't know what we were anymore. The night after dinner, she went straight home and didn't call or text. Just silence, and honestly, I didn't blame her because what were we supposed to say? I spent the next few days skipping classes, ignoring messages, eating nothing but dry cereal from a box under my bed. I just kept replaying that dinner over and over in my head. Her smile when she saw him, my mom's face when she figured it out, the question she asked me in the car. But you're adopted, right? I needed to know the truth. So I went home, but my mom wasn't there. The lights were off and mail piling up at the door. So I called her twice, but she didn't answer, and I even left a voicemail, but nothing came back. So I tried my dad, the real one, or maybe the fake one. I don't even know what to call him now. He answered on the third ring and told me he didn't want to talk over the phone and needed time to sort things out, but I was done giving people time. I wanted answers. So I started by calling the agency they said they used to adopt me, and they passed me around 3 times before someone picked up who could help. But when I gave them my name, they paused. Then they said there were no records of my adoption in their system. They asked me if I was sure I was adopted through them, but I didn't know what to say. So I hung up and sat in my car for over an hour, hands frozen on the wheel, trying to figure out what that meant. Was it a mistake, or was the truth worse than I imagined? A few days later, I got a message from my aunt, my mom's sister. We weren't that close, but I think she heard something was going on. She asked if I wanted to talk, and I drove to her house that afternoon. She made coffee and sat across from me in silence for a few minutes. Then she said,
You're digging, aren't you?
I nodded, but then she looked down and picked at the edge of her mug.
Your mom always said she couldn't carry. She tried everything, but nothing worked. But I never fully believed her.
I didn't speak and just waited, but then she said something that hit me in the chest.
You really think she would have adopted if she knew she could carry a child?
That sentence stayed with me for days. I went back to campus, but I wasn't really there. I couldn't focus. I didn't care about lectures or assignments. I stopped replying to messages from my girlfriend, not because I was mad, but because I was scared. Because every time I saw her name, I didn't see her. I saw the possibility that everything between us was built on a lie, that maybe we weren't just the children of the same man. Maybe we were more than that. The thought made me sick, not because of her, but because it would mean I'd been living in a script someone else wrote without telling me the ending. A week later, I finally texted her. I just said, "Are you okay?" But she replied 3 hours later.
Not really. I miss you.
I stared at that message for a long time. Then another one came.
Do you think there's any chance we're not actually related?
And I realized she needed an answer too, but the truth wasn't ready to show up yet. So I texted back, "I don't know, but I want to find out." The next few days were quiet again, but my mom finally texted back with just one line.
I'm not ready to talk yet. I'm sorry.
And my dad, he texted too, saying he'd write me a letter explaining everything. Not a call or a visit, but a letter. And my girlfriend stopped replying after that, but I didn't blame her. And I think we both just needed to sit with the weight of what was happening. And every time I thought about that dinner, I didn't think about the food or the moment she stood to wave at her dad. I thought about the moment she looked at me after it all, the look on her face when she asked,
You're adopted, right?
because if that answer is no, then everything else might be broken beyond repair. 3 weeks passed before we saw each other again. We met at a park halfway between our homes, and it was cold enough to see our breath when we talked, but we sat on a bench anyway, with our hands shoved in our jacket sleeves and our backs slightly turned, like we didn't know how to sit face to face anymore, but she was the first to speak.
I'm keeping the baby.
Her voice cracked a little at the end, but she didn't look away, so I nodded, not because I was ready, but because it was the only thing that felt certain anymore. I told her I wanted to be there, no matter what happened with us, and I wanted to be there for the baby. She nodded too, and then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded ultrasound photo, and she didn't say anything, just handed it to me with fingers that were trembling. It was the first time I saw the shape of our child, small, curled up, and floating in a world that made more sense than ours. I didn't cry, not yet. I just stared and tried to imagine a future where this kid didn't grow up confused, broken, or caught in someone else's lies. But then she asked if I hated her, and I said no. I said I hated what we didn't know, and I hated being scared to find out, and I hated that someone else made a choice years ago that left us standing here trying to stitch a future out of secrets, but not her, never her. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. We shared our fears, cried a little, and then cried harder when we realized neither of us wanted to walk away. So we didn't. We decided we'd co-parent no matter what, and we'd take a DNA test, not just to find out about each other, but to finally get real answers. Because we couldn't build a life for a child on what ifs and half-truths. We hugged before we left. It was long and quiet, the kind that says, "I'm still here, even when nothing feels steady." When I got home, I told my mom I needed to see her, and she invited me over the next day. I walked into the house I grew up in and realized how different it looked now. now. The warmth felt artificial, and the photos on the walls didn't hold the same weight. She was in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea like it was the only thing grounding her. We sat at the table, and I told her everything about the baby, about the dinner, about the DNA test we were planning, but she didn't interrupt, just stared down at the steam rising from her cup. When I finished, I asked her directly, "Is there anything else I should know?" She looked up, and her eyes were glassy, but she didn't cry.
I don't know what's true anymore. I don't even know what I was trying to protect when I agreed to stay quiet.
Were you protecting me? Or him? She didn't answer and just wiped a tear with the edge of her sleeve and said she couldn't talk about it yet. I told her that wasn't good enough and that I deserved better and that this baby deserved better. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. It was the first time she'd touched me since that night, and her grip was soft and weak.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
I left with more questions than I came in with. A few days later, my dad sent a long text asking if we could meet, but I didn't respond. I didn't care what he had to say, not yet. That week, I went with her to her next prenatal appointment. We sat in the waiting room with couples who held hands and whispered baby names. We didn't touch, but we kept glancing at each other like we were tethered by something invisible. When they called her name, I stood up too, and she didn't stop me. After the checkup, the doctor said the baby was healthy with a strong heartbeat and good growth. We walked out with a new set of ultrasound photos, but this time, there were tiny fingers, a hint of a nose, and a face. She looked at me and said,
We need to be strong for him.
and I realized for the first time I wasn't scared. I was angry because we were forced to be strong when we should have been allowed to just be kids in love figuring it out. But I was also grateful because despite everything, she stayed. We both did. That night, I started writing letters, one for the baby, one for her, and one for myself. The one for the baby started like this. I don't know what you'll grow up hearing about me or us or how it all started, but I promise you this, I will always tell you the truth. I knew we were far from healed. My mom still avoided calls and dad still hadn't come clean and we still hadn't taken the test, but for now, we were showing up and sometimes that was the hardest part, but also the most important one. The night before the baby was born, I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared of being a dad, though I was, but it was something else. That heavy, quiet dread I'd carried since dinner at the restaurant still hadn't gone away, and the pieces of my life were slowly fitting together. But the corners were still missing, and the silence from my mom, the way she looked when I asked about the adoption, it never sat right with me. Still, that morning, when she called and said she wanted to come to the hospital, I didn't say no. She showed up with flowers and a blanket she'd knitted months ago, before she even knew the full story, and she didn't say much, just hugged me tightly, like she was scared I'd disappear too. My girlfriend was already in labor when we arrived, and I sat by her side, holding her hand through each contraction, whispering little things just to keep her breathing steady, and her fingers were clenched around mine so tight I couldn't feel them anymore. But I didn't care. All I could do was look at her and think, we made it here, and somehow we're still standing. When the baby came, everything else disappeared. The doctor said,
It's a boy.
and placed him gently in her arms. He was tiny and wrinkly, and his mouth opened once like he was about to cry, but instead, he just blinked slowly, like he was trying to understand the world he was suddenly a part of. I looked at him and felt something crack open in my chest, but it wasn't fear or panic, just this deep, aching love that didn't come with rules or names or bloodlines. I leaned in close and whispered something without thinking. You'll never have to wonder where you came from, I promise you that. When I looked up, his mother was already crying with silent tears down her cheeks, but her smile didn't break. Later, the nurse came in with paperwork for the birth certificates, emergency contacts, first and last name. But that last one made us pause. We stared at the line for a while before she said softly,
Let's give him your name.
but I didn't argue because it felt like we were planning something permanent in the middle of a storm. A few hours passed and her dad never showed up and mine didn't either, but my mom stayed and held the baby like she'd known him forever. She rocked him gently and hummed an old lullaby I didn't even realize I remembered from childhood. And then, when we were alone in the hallway getting coffee, she said she needed to tell me something. But I could tell from the way her voice trembled that it wasn't small. She asked me to sit and said she should have told me a long time ago that the adoption wasn't what it seemed. She told me that during a short breakup with my dad before they were married, she found out she was pregnant and she panicked and she thought he'd leave if he knew it wasn't their baby. So when they got back together, she suggested the idea of adopting to make it look like a shared decision. He agreed, maybe because he didn't want to ask questions, or maybe because part of him already suspected the truth and chose to bury it. So she raised me under the story of adoption because it was easier than explaining everything else, and tears were rolling down her face now.
I never wanted you to feel like you didn't belong, but I thought if I told you the truth, maybe you wouldn't forgive me.
I didn't say anything for a long time, and my hands were shaking because I thought about all those years wondering where I came from, all those nights wondering if I was a replacement or a backup plan, and to find out that I wasn't adopted, I wasn't anybody's second choice, I was hers, always been hers. I finally asked her why. Why now? But she looked down at her hands, then back up at me.
Because I heard what you told your son, that you'd always tell him the truth.
And I realized I couldn't be the only one holding on to a lie. I nodded. Not because I forgave her yet, but because I finally understood. When I went back into the hospital room, my girlfriend was asleep with the baby tucked in the crook of her arm. And something about that moment made me feel like the future wasn't broken, just different. The DNA test came back 2 days later, and we weren't related. The relief hit me like a wave, so I sat down and cried for the first time in weeks. Not the silent kind I'd learned to master, but real, shoulder-shaking, chest-heaving sobs that came from every part of me that had been scared. We told her that night, and she smiled through her tears, and for the first time since the dinner, she touched my face and said,
We get to choose what happens next.
I kissed her forehead and held our son against my chest. And all I could think was, maybe the truth didn't destroy us, maybe it set us